and welcome to joining us at the Oxford Real Farming Conference. My name is Alison Rickett, and we're glad that you can join us today. We're going to be carrying a session out called Reaching Net Zero with Nature-Friendly Solutions, and this is part of the group that I work with the Nature-Friendly Farming Network, and our colleagues at the Woodland Trust and LEAF as well. I will hand you over to Helen Cheshire, who is the chair for the session, in just a moment. But please do pop up the questions in the Ask a Question box all the way through. We'll be collating those, and we will have a Q&A after the main presentations. But I hope you enjoy it, and we'll speak to you later. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison, and welcome to you all on behalf of the Woodland Trust too. As the world grapples with COVID-19, I really do believe the time is now to build back green. So farmers across the globe are experiencing an increased frequency of extreme weather events as a result of climate change. And here in the UK, we must face up to the fact that many of our wildlife species are in decline and much of our natural resources are degraded. Farmers are key and really well placed to help deliver net zero whilst delivering nature-friendly food and helping to restore our natural environment. So I'm absolutely delighted to bring to you today 3 UK farmers who will share their practical experiences of farming to help deliver net zero via nature-friendly solutions. Each speaker will give a short presentation lasting about 10 minutes, and we will then have 20 minutes for questions. So do please put these in the Ask a Question tab, as Alison mentioned. But while you're listening, do introduce yourselves and the organisations you represent or farms you represent in the chat, and any comments. And although we won't have access to that through the session, we will do afterwards, so can follow up with things with you afterwards. Also, just to mention now, and I'm sure Alison will again at the end, both the Woodland Trust and the Nature-Friendly Farming Network have exhibition areas, so do go and take a look at those. And we both have further sessions in the conference programme. The Woodland Trust a session on the 12th of June about the role of trees in hotter climates, perhaps not that appropriate today as I look at the snow outside my window. But also the NFFN have sessions on Monday the 11th at 11 AM when nature means business, and an open session that evening at 7 PM. So with further no more to do, I'll introduce you to the first speaker, Andrew Barber, who runs his family farming and forestry business up in the Highlands of Perthshire. Running both cattle and sheep enterprises on land over 1,000 feet in altitude means shelter plays a really important part in the business. Andrew will talk about his shelter woods and silvopastoral systems and how these integrate with his grassland management. He will explain the role these can play in helping his farm reach net zero and some of the challenges ahead. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Helen, and hello to everyone. I'm hoping you can see the slides. I take it someone will shout at me if that's not the case. But today I'm talking about the potential that wood pasture or silvopasture has as a land use in getting us towards net zero farming systems in the uplands. I could have called the talk a new justification for an old land use, as wood pasture is a well-recognised habitat throughout Europe and highly valued for its biodiversity. But I'm talking about creating new wood pasture systems very much from a productivist point of view, but I take it as a given.
Andrew, excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We only see black. We see your screen share, but it's just black. I think you might need to advance your slides or...
Can you see that?
Yes, thank you.
Right, that's the, that would have been my second slide. But absolutely not to worry. I had been talking really about the wildlife values of these type of silvopasture systems. But my attitude is really, I'm coming at it principally from a productivist point of view, but wildlife values of such a land use in silvopasture will be very positive over time when you're starting with new systems, as we have been doing here. So the uplands for us here is Highlands of Scotland, but what I've got to say, I believe, is pretty much applicable anywhere where you put trees and livestock onto the same piece of ground, agroforestry, you might call it. In our case, the farm is looking into the southern end of the Cairngorms, The land, as Helen said, all lying above 300 meters above 1,000 feet. It's an extensive grazing farm based on a grass clover system production on the cropland, which you're seeing some of the fields in front of you there. It's a high nature value farming system for those of you who like that kind of label. Back in the early 2000s, we were well on the way to getting the farm to run on agroecological lines, and we're keen to do two seemingly contradictory things. We wanted to grow trees, but not lose agricultural production. And for reasons that I don't have time to go into here today, we were keen to grow oak on the place and at a scale that would give us marketable quantities, something that my forebears had done in centuries past here. So we were also needing more shelter on the farm, but typically we didn't want to give up any significant quantity of grazing land. That would be typical for most livestock farmers. So wood pasture seemed like an interesting way out of this dilemma. And in 2009, we established 7 hectares of new wood pasture using oak as the principal species, really in an effort to learn. We were looking for timber production as well as shelter, but we had enough experience of grazing animals through existing woodland to know that a certain level of tree canopy would give us early spring grass, well ahead of that we see on open ground. Spring grass, I should say, is a bottleneck for us here at this altitude. We also felt that such a land use might help us in terms of carbon balance, but at that time we had no idea of what our footprint was. So we settled on a planting pattern to give us approximately 60% canopy cover, which we intuitively felt would maintain some level of grass production. We planted in an alley pattern at 1,600 trees a hectare. The tree density was was set by the grant system in place at the time. And the idea was to grow the trees at quite high densities to give them the best chance of developing clean timber up to 3 or 4 meters of height, and then progressively thin them out to allow free growth of the final crop trees. And we'd work back from what we thought the final crop spacing should be. And so we settled on a 15-meter alley center to alley center pattern. The grass alleys being important for managing livestock and letting sunlight onto the field layer to keep the grass growing. So we excluded all stock with a conventional stock fence and used hedging type protection products to protect against voles and to some degree hares. We gradually introduced stock once tree height and stem robustness allowed that. And what that taught us is that in larger areas, trees are much more robust than we had considered earlier. Timing is everything here, and I don't have the time today to develop this theme too much, but time of year, mineral provision, lice presence on sheep are some of the things to think about. And for those who wonder what a mature canopy at approximately 60% cover looks like, here's a slide of some of those older oak plantings I mentioned. And this was a level of grass cover which, from an agricultural point of view, we were very comfortable with as a future field layer. So I believe there's a number of points to make when talking about establishing new wood pasture in an upland setting, where there is scope on the ground to establish new woodland outside of the crop fields, but where there's at the same time a reluctance to lose that ground in perpetuity from agricultural production. And the first one to draw up is scale. Such an approach lends itself to working at bigger scale than traditional shelter belts would allow, and with potentially a much better landscape fit. For both carbon reasons, of which more later, and for timber production reasons, working at scale is very important. Here in the Scottish uplands, we don't have the choice of those high value species such as walnut. And so we need scale on our side to grow the kind of trees that suit this type of land use. And have to say that broadleaf species that are going to allow light onto the ground through their canopy are much more suitable than most conifer species. But whatever you're working with, you need to work at scale if the timber products, or the carbon indeed, is to be produced in meaningful quantities. So having taken this on board, it then becomes important to establish the wooded area at least cost. And that means using the minimum of individual tree protection products. And that inevitably means excluding stock for as short a time as possible as is necessary to get the trees away. I've touched on the timing of grazing, both when animals are introduced into such a system, but also at what times of year and in what numbers. But for us, with a rotational grazing system, it's very easy to plan and manage for that. As I mentioned, we were always interested in the carbon values that such an approach to land use might bring to the business. So this is what oak grown to deliver 60% canopy cover looks like when the trees are grown on an open growth model. It should be noted that our model of growth will be somewhat different from this, but assuming we discount any product taken from the thinnings, our trees, which are growing at yield class 6 on that site there, will give broadly similar results, provided we thin appropriately. And hopefully you can see all these figures. I won't read them all out to you. And then if we take these figures and move on to how they fit into our carbon audit, these are figures showing our most recent audit, which was done with the agricultural carbon calculator. That was done last year. And we can see how many hectares of pasture woodland might be needed to balance emissions from this from our livestock enterprise to get us towards a net zero enterprise. The first two lines on the slide come from that agricultural carbon footprinting exercise and giving our total emissions. And with the new version of agriculture, what our estimated soil sequestration is. When our new 7 hectares of pasture woodland are added in to our existing older grazed woodlands, which are a mix of semi-natural birch and some pine shelter woods, also run on a roughly 50-60% canopy model, a conservative estimate gives a further balancing contribution. And I suppose I should point out that agriculture in its current version is designed to include soil sequestration in the enterprise calculation and uses IPCC approved methodologies, at least as I understand it. Trees grown on the livestock range should also be included under this approach, but that's yet to be added to agriculture. It will come, though, we are told. Trees grown elsewhere in conventional woodlands, and this is an important point, either on the farm or off it, are seen as being in a different enterprise, as indeed we have at Fincastle here in our plantation resource, and so don't count in the enterprise calculation. Another point to make, that this type of calculation uses an average figure over the rotation to calculate the carbon sequestered. The IPCC approved methodologies follow this principle when applied to the wider woodland resource. The alternative of looking at current annual increment would just be impossible in terms of data collection. And I haven't also applied any buffering calculation, as you might find if you were applying through the Woodland Carbon Code. And a further point to make about this type of data is that the agriculture and the government, through to the IPCC, working at international reporting level, is using the GWP 100 metric to calculate the impact of methane. Many consider this to be a flawed metric, and the alternative GWP star is definitely more accurate in reflecting the impact that short-lived methane has on temperature. But as long as GWP 100 is used, we're going to be judged by that metric. And that means I would need these trees to bring me into a net zero position. We've also calculated, just for those interested, what our performance looks like using GWP star. And because we've reduced sheep numbers over the last 20 years, it shows a negative impact on rising temperatures, i.e. a negative figure of carbon dioxide production, equivalent production. The choice of metric, therefore, has huge implications for us. With one, we need all the sequestration we can get and keep it in-house to get us to net zero. And the other, we could potentially run an extra source of income for the farm from selling carbon credits. And I know it's a complicated area, but it's an absolutely fundamental one for us in the livestock sector. Whichever methodology is used, there really does seem to be a role, though, for wood pasture in getting us towards that net zero goal. We want to keep the farm going, producing livestock, but we need to do that on a net zero carbon budget. And putting roughly 10% of the farm into wood pasture looks like a good way of getting there without losing agricultural productive capacity. It would be great, of course, if government was able to support us in this effort. And at the moment, government grants aren't designed for this land use. So here's hoping that situation may change. And at that, I'll hand back. Hopefully I haven't overrun my time. Hand back to Helen.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And yes, you were spot on with timing. and a really interesting, thought-provoking session. Thank you. I'm sure we will have provoked lots of questions. So now over to our second speaker, Craig Livingston, who is the Farm and Estate Manager at Lockley Estate in Hampshire, which is an accredited leaf demonstration farm linking environment and farming. Craig will share his experience of practicing integrated farm management on a large mixed estate, and in particular looking at the role of the below ground aspects such as improving soil health in helping to help reach net zero. So over to you, Craig.
Good morning, everybody, and I hope you can see my slide, and just shout if you can't. So thank you very much for inviting me to take part today. Yeah, as you say, we're down in foggy Hampshire at the moment, which is between Salisbury and Winchester, -3 outside. So I'm pleased to be sat in here talking to everybody. So Lockley Estate, we're 1,100 hectares off mainly arable business. We've got sheep, cattle, woodland, wilding, a small veg business, and a countryside stewardship scheme that covers much of what we do. The farm's owned by the Sainsbury family, and they bought this farm in the early 80s. And it was tenanted out for a period of time, but came back in hand in the last 5 or 6 years. I joined the business in 2016. I came from an ex-agronomist role, so it was great to kind of have our vision married together with my practical experience of seeing a traditional system, which I didn't feel was working well, with the sustainable vision that the Sainsbury family have. So one of the things we did in March last year was to have sound slightly corporate, but we had a 48-hour strategy day where we looked forward and not always backwards at how the short, medium and long-term vision of our estate may look. And we set some missions, values, objectives, and how we would get there. And I would, if there was one thing that I would advise anyone to do, be it a father-son, father-daughter, landlord-tenant relationship, it was the best thing I felt we did. So this is a mindset, this is a holistic approach. And for us, it was a great thing to do. So you very much can't do the green in the red. And for this to be repeated for other businesses, it needs to be credible. And this business has to be able to stand on its own 2 feet and return an investment, so we can continue to move the business forward. We're looking at a very high risk chessboard at the moment. And to just look at that screen with trade, land use, farmland bird decline, revocation of product, national food strategy, looking at food poverty, inequality in the food system, soil degradation, net zero targets, climate mitigation, whilst we're still trying to produce nutrient dense food and trying to produce a profit that we can continue to reinvest and keep this business driving forward. But I'm totally optimistic. I think farmers will be the partner going forward in delivering some of this. And I think organisations such as Leaf and using the kind of integrated farm management discipline is a great method for farmers to deliver that. So we're a mixed farm, but we own no sheep and we own no cattle. We have great relationships with 2 graziers, one for the cattle, one for the sheep, and they're totally integrated in our system. We haven't bought any new fancy equipment. We haven't changed anything significant, but it's the old saying of marginal gains. And we've changed the system to accommodate what we do. When I came here, I was told you'll never keep sheep on this farm. Well, we've kept 1,300 sheep on this farm behind electric fences for the last 5 years. And that golden hoof impact's been fantastic. We've imported 700 tonnes a year of compost. We've got a muck for straw deal with a neighbour. We have living roots in the ground with over 200 hectares of cover crops. We've reduced our trafficking in the fields by extra discipline, extended our rotation. Our residue management has changed. We've planted 10,000 hedge plants. We've put assist pollinator strips through the middle of our fields, and our product choice, such as using fibrofos to deliver P&K as opposed to kind of mined TSP and MOP type products. So rotation for me is where this really starts. And if you look back, this is the 2 farms that the family own. So this is over 3,200 acres worth of arable crops. In 2015, the year before I came here, there was pretty much 3 crops. And I think those spring oats were there probably because some all-seed rape failed. We've now got 9 crops in the rotation. And actually this pie chart doesn't show some of the clover-rich grass that we've got in the rotation and the countryside stewardship options that are already in here. So this rotation allows us to integrate the compost, the muck, the cover crops and things. It allows us to be far more accurate, allows our technique and timing to be better, allows us to produce crops which people want, slightly more niche. And for me, the main thing it does is it's allowed us to reduce our fertilizer tons by over 30% in the last 5 years. Our spend on pesticides is reduced by 40% in the last 5 years. 60% of the seed we plant is now planted without a seed dressing, and our cultivations, still using the same equipment, have either significantly shallowed, or we share now a zero-till drill with our other farm 30 miles away. So the rotation has really enabled us to change our thinking, and most importantly, nothing goes through our system without, as we call it, a shot in the arm for soil health. So a lot of what happens below ground is influenced by what happens above ground. And if you look at our cover crops, we're growing an array of different cover crops, probably not quite as adventurous and as diverse as I've learned on these conferences, and that's something we'll try and get better at going forward. But our main objectives are nutrient capture, living roots in the ground with the kind of regen principles, and to create forage for the sheep. So I'm involved in lambing the 700 ewes at lambing time, but we also don't have any involvement in moving the sheep and things, but we work together to get that footprint just right before there's any negative effects of livestock on the soil. So we view the cover crops very much as solar panels. We're capturing solar energy, we're capturing CO2, we're using water, we harvest the solar and we create sugar, and that sugar inevitably is the energy exchange, which helps the structure below ground. It feeds the soil biome, and everything else that we're trying to do. That very much gets into the territory of the soil scientists and a language which we're new and learning. I won't bore you with the details on here. The main thing for these graphs and the numbers are the bottom left-hand table. It shows you in pounds. So wherever you're calling in from today, be it dollars or euros, on average, we're harvesting or capturing 170 sterling pounds worth of nutrients of N, P and K. So either we're putting on too much nitrogen on our following crops, or nitrogen that we now don't need, or we're managing to pull P and K from the soil without having to put it on from the bag. So some of that nutrients will go within the sheep, but that's good because we're also producing a food product in sheep meat, but we're also delivering all the other things through the golden hoof. And I think it's important also to recognise that by grazing our cover crops, we're reducing our reliance on glyphosate and such things as well. Farming is absolutely at the sharp, pointy end of this, and there's a heck of a lot of pressure on farmers today. I think it's fair to say we're relearning a new language. I was brought up on the word control. Well, control means kill. That's weeds, pests, and diseases. We're now relearning the art of observation and doing nothing, and having the confidence to do nothing. Surrounding ourselves with people where the advice is not to intervene using cans and bags, it's to watch and observe. We're learning a new language, and we're currently weaning ourselves off a different system. So indicators below ground for us are things like worms, how the roots in cover crops are cultivating for us, how well colonized the rhizosphere around the root mass is, the depth, the color of the roots. These are all indicators which show us hopefully that our farm is heading in the right direction. We've got 11 different soil types from light shallow chalk to heavy clay cap. But this is just an example of that we test pretty much everything. We have 5 satellite stations around the farm, and we test all our seed to ensure that we don't need to use things like seed dressings where possible. But this isn't just soil. We baseline bird surveys, moths, arable flora, obviously birds and ponds and things, working with the local wildlife trust. So bringing this into the carbon calculator, we prefer the farm carbon calculator as our preferred method. At the moment, last year we emitted 561. This year it's down to 388. Next year, by having dropped oilseed rape, significantly increased our pulses and our different options, and several other things that we're doing, I anticipate will be about 150 tonnes emitted, and by 2022 into 23 the estate will be net zero. That doesn't mean we've won, because we want to be sub-zero, and we need to be looking at the operations neutral. So our biggest offenders are the blue bags and the red diesel, and we are working really hard to identify how we correct this. So in order to stay within time, We are all about market creation and gentle disruption, steering from the back of the ship. I'm not going to wait for policy or anybody else to tell us the direction which we need to go. We are creating our own meat boxes, our rewilding area, our vegetables, our egg production, our own wheat into our own flour. This market creation is for local people to trust us, to look at the farm and be part of the environment they farm in, but it's still to produce and turn over a profit because we are a business. And this can then be repeated by other people as we're trying to demonstrate. So in summary, there's 3 key points. One is mindset. This is a total mindset change. This needs the engagement of everybody involved, so everybody is on the bus. It's holistic, the engagement and management from top to bottom and left to right, and it's a discipline. And I think that I stand really optimistic looking forward as farmers that we can be the delivery of change through net zero with friendly farming. Thanks.
Thank you, Craig. That was excellent. 3 really good points to end on to stimulate, again, I'm sure, more questions. But let's move on to our third speaker, and then we'll have plenty of time for those questions. Our third speaker is Martin Lines, an arable farmer and contractor from South Cambridgeshire, and also the UK chair and founder of the Nature Friendly Farming Network. Martin will focus his talk on more about those above ground solutions, such as reduced tillage and fuel savings for arable farming, but he'll also explain a little bit about the work of the Nature Friendly Farming Network. So over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Helen. So first slide up is practical ways to get to net zero, or should that be sub-zero? As UK farmers and farmers across the world, we have the opportunity to capture and store carbon for ourselves and for others. So I think our focus, as Craig just explains, is to get our own business down and then look at opportunities to capture and store for other people who can't do those opportunities.
Excuse me, Martin. Sorry to interrupt you. We just see, your full screen on your screen share. We don't see your actual presentation.
Hang on. So that's not working?
No, you're sharing your entire screen. So what you can do is you can stop screen sharing and try again from your application window. There we are. Thank you very much. Sorry to
Okay. And is that working there?
Yes, perfect.
Yep. So for me, as a farmer, and in the past, it's looking at how we produce as much as we can from the landscape, and what we produce is changing. In the past, we've mainly focused about production, producing commodities to the highest possible yields. But as we see the new challenges to reach net zero and to also tackle our climate emergency, we need to change the focus we can get from our landscape. The more we can understand our soils and our landscape, we understand that true productivity, and actually that makes our businesses more profitable when we work at that sustainable output model of what we can best get from our landscapes. So for me, as an arable farmer in Cambridgeshire, the focus is now to produce as much as possible for the best margin for all the goods and services we can produce, and we can deliver those nature-based solutions across our farm landscape to fit in with our farming businesses. And we need to work across that whole landscape to get that change to happen. And we need to do this at speed. And as Craig was saying, we need to drive us as farmers and land managers to reach those targets and not always wait for policymakers to lead us in a direction. So my focus has been about soil health and operational costs. We, as Craig touched on, bring in a huge amounts of organic material, recycled compost from our local green waste centre, the picture up in the top left hand. But we also have great concerns with the amount of waste product, as you see in the bottom left, that consumers are putting in their green waste, and the threat of bringing that microplastic back onto our farmland. But that's such a huge green waste source to fertilise our soil, reduce my operational costs, and actually make a circular system of green waste. We also bring in large amounts of chicken manure and horse manure, And that is placed on our fields through GPS. So we know the sample of the soil, we know what the crop expected yield can be for the individual half hectares of each field. It's all GPS mapped and soil sampled and yield mapped. So we can actually go down to that individual detail of not pushing our landscape beyond its natural capacity, but also reducing our operating costs and our overheads. So all that manure is spread where it's needed for the amount it's needed, and it's replaced all of our artificial phosphate, potash, and up to 40 to 60% of our artificial nitrogen. And as we improve our operation, we can continue driving down those artificial uses, because when we look forward, every time they're mining potash and phosphate and transporting it, that has a carbon footprint, and it's a non-renewable source. So we need to be smarter in the way we farm and where we plant those products. As I looked across our farm, we have parts of our land and our fields that are not efficient to farm with modern machinery, or are in and don't give me an efficient yield. So we're increasing tree planting across the farm in different pockets, making connectivity and joining it up with other things. We've put over 5.5 kilometres of new hedgerow in the last few years. But it's also, what can we plant underneath those trees? How can we have additional delivery amongst those? And that connectivity of pollination and predatory insects across our farms. And by driving that down as a business, we're no longer needing to use insecticides. I think it's the 9th year we've been doing that now. And it's having the confidence to deliver the nature-based solutions and habitat and those carbon-rich sources that are there for the whole year that deliver the benefit back to my business. When we run and operate our machines, all tractors are on low-pressure tyres, and some are now fully operational from within the cab. So as we enter the field, we can reduce oil-soil compaction by adjusting our tyre pressures and our operations. I recognise the severe damage a lot of our cultivation was doing to our soil and the huge cost that was implying to our businesses. So over 5 years, we farmed ourselves out of the soil, recognised the compaction that we have caused in the past and the soil degradation, and found an operating system to correct that and move out of the soil. So as you see on the bottom right-hand side, that's us now drilling. We operate a crimp roller on the front of the drill to squash down and to try and terminate cover crops. For some mixes, as we've reduced our weed burden, we've been successful to use just the crimp roller and no glyphosate. But at times, as we're going through the transition, we're still needing to use some. And the objective is to use as little as possible. But by keeping our soil covered all the time, we're avoiding that soil compaction, we're capturing those nutrients, and making the farming job a lot better. And actually our fields are now singing with nature and with pollinators and predatory insects because we've avoided that disturbance. As Craig also mentioned, we've also brought the sheep back. We recognise in the benefits by having those fields covered in green manure and green cover crops all year round. It's preventing our soils drying out and heating up. So it's making a better place to plant our crops. And my father used to say, fertiliser out the bum is out better than out the bag. And it's not just the nutrients it brings, it's the biology and bacteria and the ecosystem which drives down my costs. So now my fungicide bill is reduced by 40%, and I've reduced my herbicide bill by 60%. By looking and farming in a more nature-based solutions way and a systems approach, we drive down our costs. Some yields are reduced, but the overheads are less. We actually need to work with our landscape's natural capacity. So in the uplands and various where the pastures are, it's not going to be a case of having to tree everything. We can carry on farming, and we actually need to see a farmed landscape across the UK. But much of those sheep and those cattle can come across onto my arable system and actually fertilise my soil to reduce my costs and reduce the carbon footprint. As when we're combining, we no longer need to harvest right down to the floor. We do very little baling. A neighbouring livestock farm has a little bit. So we can cut a lot higher. The less material that goes through our combine reduces my diesel burn. So we're actually saving around 6 litres a hectare by just lifting the combine header up and making the whole job more efficient. And I look right through my farming operations of where I can make savings. As I say, we've incorporated more trees and more habitat and get the benefits from our business. I'll touch on the network that we launched 3 years ago at the Oxford Rural Farming Conference, and it's a great time to be celebrating our 3rd anniversary. Last year, we produced a document to help the rest of the industry think about their carbon footprint and give practical guides and ways of it going forward. And you can find that guide on our website, and also it's on our stand. So there's many short-term things that farmers and easy wins farmers can deliver. There's a number of big challenges to be thinking about, but it's what can you do on your farm to improve your hedgerows, your trees, your natural capital. Reduce artificial fertiliser. Much of that's based on fossil fuel, and that's going to be a limited resource in time. Reduce your fuel use, your energy consumption, and think about when you invest in new machinery, what's the carbon footprint of that? To improve our soil rotation and cropping, livestock emissions, and improve our manure handling. A lot of the emissions is coming from our manures. We need to farm and manage that in smarter ways. Peatland restoration, we need to think about our upland peatland, but also our lowland. As our water levels increase and the sea comes in, we're going to have to think about moving away from a lot of that peatland farming. Look at the trees and other opportunities. Much of this you'll find on our website. So we need to get the national government and local governments also engaged with this and look at market instruments for carbon labelling and assessing where we can have a standardisation of how we measure going forward. Changing demand will come, but we also need to make that representative and transparent to the supply chain and to consumers. And we really support the Fair to Nature, where we're delivering 10% of biodiversity alongside reducing our carbon footprint. So that's my last slide. Thank you very much.
That was excellent. But all three of you have kept to time. So we've now got a good 20 minutes to take the questions, which I'm just getting passed through to me. But also just to say that we've got the Zoom breakout session following straight on from this. So the link to that Zoom will be put in the chat just before the end of this session. And there you'll be able to have more of an informal discussion, and we can continue with some of the questions with Martin, Craig and Andrew. So I'm just trying to find which questions to start with. Right, sorry, do bear with me. So there's quite a few questions. There's one or two questions more specifically to Andrew in terms of some of the practical aspects of silvopasture or wood pasture, Andrew. Questions about the different planting densities. You talked about 60% canopy cover. Are there any other variations on that density that you would recommend? And also a question about, have you used deer fencing for your wood pasture? So maybe while I'm sorting out some of the other questions, Andrew, you might be able to answer that to start with.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. First of all, the canopy cover, there's no right and there's no wrong, but I think as you go much above 60%, you're moving much more into a normal woodland, and that usually reduces, as canopy closes, that usually reduces what botanists call the field layer, you know, the grass cover on the bottom, and that's the bit you need to maintain for the agricultural side. And as you drop down the canopy cover to, I don't know, 20, 30%, then you start to move more towards parkland. And from a tree point of view, you are obviously less trees on the ground, less carbon being sequestered. So, and the chances are low density trees, you're not going to produce utilizable timber if you're looking at it from a traditional productivist forestry point of view. So there are trade-offs right through, and we felt we went for 60%. There's nothing to say that that was right, but somewhere between the 40, 60%, I guess, is the right kind of figure. Tree density, we were stuck with the grant scheme. 1,600 trees a hectare, I think, is probably too much. you would, if you were designing a new grant scheme for this land use, as I was describing it, I think you'd be between 500 and 1,000 trees a hectare, probably around about 1,000. And lastly, deer fencing. Yeah, we control roe deer with the rifle, and so that was that way around that problem. But we did get reds coming into that system. That was new for us, and eventually we had to put a hot wire around, which is a very effective way out of controlling marauding red deer. So that is a local issue. It depends what kind of deer presence you've got on the place. But you have to think about deer, absolutely.
Thank you, Andrew. There's quite a lot of questions about the different ways of calculating carbon sequestration. So I think if we start with the general question, and I'll ask all three of you in turn to take an answer to it, is really what your experience of using the different calculators and what methodologies or tips you would give people on the various calculators and methodologies that you've used. So perhaps if we start with Martin first.
They all give us different results. We've tried 3 now. We need some standardization, and also how we trade that, not just in the UK, but with products if we're going to have carbon labeling. What I do say is do something. Pick whatever scheme you like to give you an understanding of where your carbon footprint is now, and it gives you a baseline to go forward, while there's some standardization in all the different schemes that you can join.
Craig, would you like to go next?
Yeah, totally agree with Martin, really. I think the calculators we picked the farm carbon calculator because it takes account of our whole business. So we need to use, as an arable farmer, at the moment we're using the hedges, the woodland, everything else, the clover grass lays that we've got in to try and buffer and be the net sequester for us. I think what would make things easier is an agreed platform, like Martin says. I think, we've got targets 2050, 2040. We've got internal targets, operation zero here by 2030. At the moment, we've got a burning bridge in timescale. So we have no agreed way of measuring organic matter, which is a simplistic way of looking at soil, and no true agreed way of a calculator. And it's a huge amount of work. Leaf Sustainable Farm Review already exists. Farm Bench, the calculator, is there. If we can pull some of this information together and stop the duplication, that would make our life much quicker.
Thank you, Craig. And Andrew, just before you start answering, there's a couple of specific points that were asked in relation to your presentation as well within this subject area. One was, are you including the grass sequestration that's from within the wood pasture or only from the trees? And another one was, in your calculation account for carbon released, does it take into account the carbon release from the trees thinned when they're used for wood fuel? Or do the net zero calculations use models assuming all trees planted and growing will lock up carbon in perpetuity? So sorry, there's sort of 3 questions in amongst all that. One, the general question of your experience, and then there's 2 specific ones.
Well, we've worked with Agriculture because that's the one that's pushed up in this part of the world. It's a product of the SRUC, and government support that. So, but I absolutely take the points that Craig and Martin have made. We need standardization. We need to be able to present these figures through to the marketplace and onwards into the wider world. Very, very important. And they're far from up to the task, the current suite of carbon calculators. They've got quite a long way to go. I think all the people who produce these calculators would accept that. So it's their work in progress. The carbon figures produced, which for oak, there didn't include the grassland. No, they were just the woody biomass part of the calculation. And when you look at thinnings, the thinnings were excluded from the models that crude model that I presented. One assumes that we were going to grow. I was assuming that I was going to grow the oak largely on a free growth model. So those early thinnings will depends actually what we do with the thinnings as to whether the carbon goes straight back to the atmosphere as wood fuel would, or if we compost, if we chip it, compost, and put back into the soil, there's a chance of the carbon some of that carbon being captured in the soil And that's quite an interesting route for livestock farmers as the price of straw and issues around straw availability come up. The third one, which is quite a long way off, is biochar, and again going back into the soil, and that's something that we're quite keen to look at. But there's quite a lot of development work to be done there. Does that help?
I'm sure it does. Thank you, Andrew. Yes, there's also, just before we move off the sort of carbon calculation type questions, there's a general question again for all three of you. What role do payments for carbon sequestration have, and should these be raised from taxation or direct payments from emitters? So I'm not sure if you just want to all briefly give your thoughts on that. Again, shall I start with Martin?
I think it's measuring ourselves, getting ourselves down and understanding. And as land managers, we have the opportunity to trade it because we can hopefully store it. So yeah, government needs to lead on some of it. And the industry needs to lead on some of it, because what we don't want to do as a business is conform to somebody else's payment structure or trading platform. We may need to look at building our own.
Craig?
Yeah, the old saying, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. So you need to start somewhere and start with a tool and just stick with the same tool. Martin said earlier that we need to farm all our goods and services. And in a minute, carbon, not in a minute now, the climate emergency, soil degradation, all that sits equal with food production. So we need to understand how to farm carbon as well and make it fit with our system, which you can.
Andrew, do you have any more thoughts you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think for us, the really interesting question is how you define the performance and whether it's done at the business level or at the enterprise level. And at the moment, we are largely judged at the enterprise level, not the business level. And that is, when it comes to trees and offsetting and all the rest of that, that's a really, really important point. And it's a presentational point, which is that there's a war going on in the wider world with agriculture right at the center of it. And PR is one of those tools that are used by both sides. And we need some clarity on these, how this data is presented. These are big issues, and the offsetting one in particular is a really, really big issue.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. I think you made some very good points, and a lot of it is about those messages that are out there and how the sector as a whole combats some of what seems to be quite negative feedback at times. And again, a lot of it goes down to much better understanding and education, which, certainly, organisations like Nature Friendly Farming Network and LEAF really do a lot of very good in that area. A general question again, but perhaps start with Craig first on it, is about how any suggestions you might have in terms of improving the collaboration between farmers, certainly from different neighbours. You talked about how you have livestock on your farm, but they're not yours. So if you have some general ideas about how to take that forward.
Yeah, so we've got 5 full-time people on this 1,100 hectares, and that's a working forestry, a firewood business, and other things. So we do our own agronomy and bits and bobs. So we try and keep everything. We need 5 decision makers. There's no kind of hierarchy here as such. So it's really important that we haven't got the skill set, we haven't got the time and all the facilities. We've done all the numbers on having our own stock and taking land out of production and whatnot. And actually, we've got other people that need to work with us. They need winter feed. They need our shed space and things. So the relationship's really good. Sometimes, at some point, I think you just need to realise you can't win at everything. There needs to be a long-term vision, and it's not about the 40 pence per head per week for each sheep or whatever your deal might be. It's about the long-term value that they can add to your system, and that's part of that mindset that we talked about earlier. We're also part of a catchment-wide project, 5,000 hectare catchment-wide project, which is all about the triple SI chalk stream, and that's 21 farms collaboration together, which is again another impact level on the whole environment, which is good.
That sounds brilliant. Yeah, Martin, would you like to add any comments or examples?
Yeah, I think it's, if we look at nature-based solutions, we need to do that at a landscape scale, and that collaboration of farmers in a landscape, in a catchment. And then you can move those resources about, share those livestock, but you can also add value to those livestock because you can feed the local community. You can put that local story about the value of that livestock that's managed the ecosystem and the carbon capture in your catchment to the local community and to the wider community. So that collaboration we can add value to, and get farmers working together to share costs and share the story that we should be telling about why and how we manage our landscape and what we can do for nature and carbon.
Andrew, do you have anything to add? And obviously you do integrate pretty well on your farm as well, but already between forestry and livestock, which is another angle of looking at it.
Well, yeah, and I suppose taking the point about landscape level, you could even go bigger and go to whole sectoral level, because the link between uplands and lowlands, which was so strong, has to a degree been broken by the stockless arable systems that have become popular. That simplification and intensification has really not been good from the livestock point of view. I'm not sure you want to go back to high stocking levels in the uplands, because you can have too much stock in the uplands, and we've been there. But making those links again, and in a theoretical world, your animals would travel with a carbon passport, and that would be a selling point, depending on the carbon metrics and all the rest of it, for us to make our livestock attractive to you good folks in the lowlands who have the ability to take the animals onto market and contribute to your farming system. You want the animals in the wintertime, not the summertime. We want them in the summertime, not the wintertime. So there's got to be sectoral opportunities there if we can build those.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, I'm conscious of the time. So there's a lot of people have asked about the pulses. Are these produced for humans or livestock consumption? And how realistic is it for large pulse scale production of human grade pulse production to take place in the UK? Craig, do you perhaps want to start with that one?
Yep. So we dropped oilseed rape last year because we weren't very good at growing it because of historical reasons. It was too close in the rotation. It's a high input crop that needs a lot of synthetics, be it pesticides or fertilizer, and it didn't fit within our system. So oilseed rape's gone, and the natural replacement for us to fit with our vision is pulses. We've plotted our crops like a pension. So basically, what's the risk and reward, and then how much risk and reward are we prepared to take? So spring beans on this land, some of the heavy land, can be tricky if they're later planted and it dries. But if you look at the less cultivations required following beans and the less nitrogen required following beans, then as a whole rotation, as opposed to just individual crops, we're more profitable. Yes, we try for human consumption on everything we do to add value, but we won't spray insecticides sometimes on in flowering crops such as beans because of resistance issues, and it doesn't fit with our policy. So if there's bruchid beetle issues, for example. But the options are, soya is getting more, the varieties are changing. We've got spring peas going in this year, and obviously clover grass lays and things. So yeah, the countryside stewardship options with 2-year legging fallows is another way for us to break up that sort of mosaic of the landscape.
Martin, would you like to?
I think there's a huge opportunity to increase pulses within the farming system. At the moment, we undervalue the pulses. It's the poorest cousin within the rotation, and actually, it's because of other imported products that have a different carbon footprint and a different environmental footprint. And I think we need to be bold in stopping some of that imports that would lift the price of our pulses to reduce the risk of growing it. As Craig said, doing spring beans on heavy ground is hugely risk of boom or bust. And actually, by having an increased commodity value, and we should really focus all what we do in feeding people. That's the priority. And then what those commodities that don't make that grade, we use for animal feed. But there's many animals that can actually not need the protein source. We can feed other things. So there's a huge opportunity of fruit, nuts, and pulses. We just need to look forward about how we deliver it and the market recognition for the price of what we produce.
Thank you, Martin. Andrew, do you want to add anything?
No, well, pulses are a low ground issue, but unfortunately. But people have looked, and certainly in Scotland, there was a recent study looking at what food production could look like if you moved your grain producing areas into pulse producing or as part of the rotation, and stopped feeding lots of grain to chickens and whatever other animals are consuming. And that's part and parcel of this big argument. What do you use your better land for? And it's a big subject.
Okay, I'm just conscious that we're of time, and there's literally hundreds of questions. Quite a quick one, which I'll start with Andrew from his Scottish perspective point of view first, and then move to Craig and Martin. Is there funding available for farmers to conduct a carbon audit?
Yes, there's the audit cost is covered fully, and you just have to be, if you're VAT registered, pay the VAT element of it. You get 100% cover for your first audit and 50% contribution from the Scottish Government for your second audit. And
do they prescribe which calculator you have to use, or is it free to go to whichever one?
No, it's I think I'm right in saying it's prescribed. Yes, I think you just go with the calculator that's given to you, which is the one run by SRUC, so it's AgriCalc. Whether you could use another one without paying extra for it, I'm honestly not sure. I suspect not.
Okay, thank you. So that's a Scottish perspective. Craig?
As far as I'm aware, no. In England, we are involved in a test and trial pilot with Leaf and the Sustainable Food Trust, so our time is covered through that test and trial. But as for filling out a form and not involved in a test and trial, then no, I don't think it is.
Martin, do you have anything to add on Craig?
Yeah, there's no current funding, but if the Scottish Government can fund Scottish farmers, why can't the rest of the governments across the UK step up to the challenge and help us drive down our carbon footprints by helping or supporting us doing those carbon metrics?
Yeah, that's a good point. Right, before we get pushed into Zoom, I'm just trying to... there's another angle actually on the calculator question, is should the calculations produced include the costs of marketing? So all of you have mentioned the opportunities that marketing a product with a carbon, a good carbon footprint has to offer. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that particular angle. Start with Martin.
My operation and my carbon footprint goes with my product. It's down the supply chain should pay for my carbon sequestration or whatever. I don't want to offset it up the supply chain. So we need to keep what the farmer can do on the farm. And the supply chain deals with their own aspect, not robbing my carbon.
Craig, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, totally agree. Market creation, local community, and it starts and stops on the farm. But as for sourcing and selling wider than here, is looking at the distance it travels, where it comes from, and its provenance and things.
Andrew, do you want to add anything further?
No, I absolutely agree with what's been said. Yeah.
Right. This one has been directed to Martin and Craig. You've given excellent examples of how to apply a holistic system to a modern farm management. What does the world look like for farmers who believe that the demand for food will supersede everything else and think they can trade their way out of the future by upping production rather than embracing the new world that we can all see coming? So very quickly, Craig, do you want to start?
Yeah, you've got to embrace change. Martin said it perfectly. We've got to farm all our goods and services and use the whole estate and do what every other business would do and make your assets work for you. So it's not just about food, but we certainly can't forget food.
Thank you. Martin?
Food's very important, but when we're realistic on what we produce, over half the grain we produce is not feeding people. We have huge land areas that produce energy and other things. Let's be realistic of what we can use our land asset for and what we need as society from that asset. So we can do good quality, high density food, but we need to think about how else we use our landscape and get value from it as businesses.
And Andrew, you're perhaps in a slightly different position, being up in the uplands, where some of the threat is that the threat from things like mass tree planting to deal with climate change is making farmers feel under threat from being able to produce food. So I'm not sure what you have in comments.
Absolutely, and well, it's absolutely seen as a problem. Scotland is seen as the place where carbon sequestration takes place, and most of the studies that look at a UK level, oh, you'll do it in Scotland, and And in actual fact, when you look at Scotland, that really means the bits they're talking about, like the Climate Change Committee, they're really talking about the bits that are currently farmed, the central Scotland, the southern half of Scotland, because the Highlands of Scotland, much of it is given over to sporting purposes, deer management and whatnot. So big issues for us in all this. Yep, definitely.
Okay, I think now we probably, am I correct, Josh, that we need to leave this session and move over to Zoom? So I'm hoping that everybody that's watching us on Crowdcast is able to join us in Zoom. If you're not, then thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you found it useful. We will be seeing the messages in the chat later, so we will respond to any individual questions or points. And don't forget to go and visit the various exhibition areas within the conference and our various sessions afterwards. But I'm hoping that most of you can join with us in Zoom. So I'll hopefully see you there in a minute or so. Josh, from a technical point of view, is there anything you want to add?
No.
No? Okay, so I think if we can all leave this area, as in the presenters, and move over to Zoom, we'll hopefully see you there. Thank you.